I'm Frank Garza, and welcome to Here and Abroad, a podcast that follows the U.S. men's national team and their player pool across Europe, MLS, or wherever else they play their club football. Okay, the format for today's show is a little bit different than what you're used to. Normally, I talk with journalists who cover the USMNT, but today I'm riding solo due to a few scheduling issues. So it'll just be me today, but next week we'll return to our normal format with a guest. And on today's show, what we're going to talk through is 3 potential surprises that you could see when the USMNT roster for the Nations League gets announced next week. So why am I choosing this topic? Well, even though the roster seems fairly predictable to me, I would say, out of the 23-man roster that they're going to announce, I feel pretty comfortable that I could predict 22 out of the 23 players with a lot of confidence. The only one I'd be lacking is maybe that third goalkeeper spot, which we'll talk about goalkeepers a little bit more later. But even though this roster seems fairly predictable, one thing I've seen from Gregg Berhalter is that he usually finds a way to offer up at least one complete surprise when he makes his roster announcement. So I'll give you a few examples. Going all the way back to the 2022 World Cup roster, it was a big surprise not to include Zach Steffen after he had been the starter and he had been a regular on the team during most of the cycle. He just completely got left off of that World Cup roster. That was probably the biggest surprise of that roster. But also including Haji Wright as a striker on that roster was a big surprise because he had really barely appeared throughout the World Cup qualifying cycle. More recently, the September 2023 camp roster for the friendlies against Uzbekistan and Oman, Christopher Lund was included for the first time, and he's a guy that really came out of nowhere. I didn't even know who Christopher Lund was when he got announced for that roster. Same with October 2023. Leonard Maloney makes the roster for the friendlies against Germany and Ghana. Another guy I really didn't know about, and then out of nowhere he gets named to a USMNT roster. So that's the kind of things I'm talking about, is that even when the roster seems fairly predictable, a lot of times Gregg Berhalter will have one of these big surprises that seems to come out of nowhere that makes the roster. So on today's show, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take 3 guesses of who an out of nowhere kind of roster call-up could be. I'm not necessarily predicting that these will happen. It's more like these have maybe a 5 to 10% chance of happening. That's kind of what I'm going for here. But I'm also not going to call out, just really small surprises. Like I'm not going to tell you that the big surprise is Mark McKenzie making the roster over a Cameron Carter-Vickers at center back or that sort of thing. Even though that would be a surprise, I wouldn't call that a shocking surprise. So I just thought this would be a fun exercise to do because Berhalter does seem to come up with at least one big surprise per roster. Okay, so surprise number 1. I'm going to start with goalkeeper. And this is the one where I do think we probably have the highest chance of seeing a surprise. So Matt Turner and Ethan Horvath, they're going to be on the roster, I would say, for sure. But who is that third goalkeeper? It's not clear who that third goalkeeper is. And according to the CONCACAF Nations League roster rules, you have to bring 3. So it's not just like they'll say, hey, we'll bring 2 because there's only 2 matches. They have to bring 3. And so to kind of look for some clues on who that third might be, who some of the surprises might be, you can look through this 60-player provisional roster that all 4 teams who are participating in the Nations League Final Four have to submit. They've already submitted these. And then when they pull the 23-man roster, it has to be 23 players from this 60-player provisional roster. So this is really the only choices that Gregg Berhalter will have. So outside of Matt Turner and Ethan Horvath, when I look at the other goalkeepers that were included on that roster, we have Drake Callender, Zach Steffen, Sean Johnson, Diego Cochin, Patrick Schulte, and Gaga Slonina. So it has to be one of those guys. Drake Callender and Zach Steffen, I don't think those would be huge surprises, so I'm not going to choose one of them. I think there's a good chance Drake Callender is the guy who will get that third goalkeeper spot. And Zach Steffen, while it would be a little bit surprising because he's been injured for so long, he's just getting back into playing. I don't think it's going to be him. Sean Johnson is another guy that I think he's kind of past his time with the U.S. men's national team. So I think it's going to be one of these three. In terms of like if it's going to be a surprise, I think it's going to be one of these three young players: Diego Cochin, Patrick Schulte, or Gaga Slonina. Now, one thing we got to consider is that the U23 Olympic team is also going to have a camp in March. It's going to be one of their last camps before the Olympics. And Gaga Slonina and Patrick Schulte are the goalkeepers that are expected to play for that team. I don't think they're going to want to disrupt that team's preparations by pulling one of those guys, especially Gaga Slonina, who's likely going to be starting for that team. And so I don't think it's going to be one of them. The guy I'm going to go with is Diego Cochin. Okay, so he's a guy I'm not super familiar with, but he plays for Barcelona. He's 17 years old. And when I say he plays for Barcelona, I mean he's not playing for one of the, number 2 or number 3 teams. I mean, this guy is actually dressing for matches. He's on the bench. He's not the starter, of course, but he is on the bench. He was on the bench for their last couple of matches in La Liga that I just checked out. He has played for their senior team in a club friendly against Club America in December. So this is a guy that is good enough to where he's at least one of the top 2 or 3 options for Barcelona right now. He's also a dual national. He has eligibility to play for the U.S. because he was born here, but he also has eligibility to play for Venezuela and Peru through his parents. And I've also read that Spain is interested in bringing him to the national team because he could become eligible by playing there. He's played for the U.S. U17s already, so he's already played in our youth systems. And so I think he's playing for a team at the highest level, in Barcelona, even though he's not getting the minutes. I mean, they wouldn't be bringing him along on game day if they didn't think so highly of him. And I think because of this dual national aspect that he brings, being able to represent multiple teams, multiple countries are going to be recruiting him. Maybe he's just a guy you bring in and you say, hey, we're going to bring him in for a first team camp so that he can kind of see what the team culture is like. He's going to see what things are like here. Let's go ahead and bring him in. He's a guy that normally would go to the U20s to play, which is also having a camp. But I just think, okay, if you're going to bring in a young goalkeeper, why not, go ahead and bring this guy in? So, again, I'm not predicting that's going to happen. I'm just saying if you're looking for a surprise that Gregg Berhalter might make here with the roster, I think Diego Cochin at goalkeeper is one possible surprise. Okay, so let's go with surprise number 2. For surprise number 2, I'm going to go with center back, because I do think that this is one of the positions that's still kind of unsettled, even though there is 4 or 5 guys that seem to be, that kind of have a hold on the USMNT roster spot. I think maybe because there is some uncertainty here, maybe there's somebody you'll bring in to test out and get a look at ahead of the Copa America. So 23-man roster, we would normally bring in 4 center backs. I think that's going to be Tim Ream, Chris Richards, Miles Robinson, and Cameron Carter-Vickers. Mark McKenzie is also someone who's been called in recently, so it wouldn't be a total surprise if he got called in instead of one of those guys. It'd be a slight surprise, but it's not the big surprise I'm looking for here. So again, you go to this 16-man provisional roster that the U.S. had to submit for Nations League participation, and there's really only 3 more center backs that are on that list. You have Austin Trusty, who's playing for Sheffield United in the Premier League. You have Walker Zimmerman, who is playing with Nashville. He's been out with injury for a while, but he looks like he's been back the last couple of weeks. I think he's got the start the last couple of games for Nashville. And then you have John Brooks, who is still starting regularly in the Bundesliga for Hoffenheim, who currently sits 7th in the Bundesliga, so they're playing at a high level, having a good season. The guy I'm going to go with here for the big surprise is John Brooks. I think Walker Zimmerman, you kind of know what you're going to get with him. He's had this injury, so you kind of leave him at Nashville, let him get back up to full fitness. Austin Trusty, you could bring him in. He has been playing regularly in the Premier League, but Sheffield United is not, really doing so well. John Brooks is this guy that's been playing at a high level in the Bundesliga for quite a while. Gregg has even mentioned him in various press conferences as somebody that's still in this pool of players to consider. And so he's a guy that I think, okay, if you are seriously going to consider him for the Copa America or something like that, bring him into the camp. It's been a while. See how it is. Test it out. He's the guy that I think you would bring in out of those three guys. Who do you leave off? Well, maybe you leave off Cameron Carter-Vickers because he's coming back from injury as well. I don't know, but that's it. John Brooks is my big surprise that you could see at center back. Okay, and then the last one, this one I kind of went back and forth on for my number 3 surprise. Originally I wanted to go outside back here because that's also an area of need for the USMNT. But when I looked through the 60-player roster and really tried to think of who the one big surprise option would be, I had settled on Reggie Cannon. He's a guy that used to be in the team for a while, got injured, then he wasn't with the team for a while. Now he's back at Queen's Park Rangers, playing in the English League Championship, but he's not starting. He's not getting into games. I looked at their last 3 or 4 games, and I don't even think he got a minute. Also, Queen's Park Rangers is near the bottom of the table in the championship, so I just couldn't convince myself that there was any scenario where he would be brought in. I also thought about Brandon Vasquez coming in at striker because I think that he's just doing so well in Liga MX, and he gives you a different kind of look as a striker, but I didn't think that would be a bold enough surprise. I don't think that would be as shocking if we saw, Gregg Berhalter put him on the roster. So I decided to go with winger. Okay, so hear me out here. This is probably, of all 3 kind of surprises I'm talking about here, this is the one I think is probably the least likely to happen, but I'm going to go with it anyway. Okay, so at winger, USMNT usually brings in 4. I think it's going to be Christian Pulisic, Tim Weah, Kevin Paredes, and Brennan Aronson. But, Aronson hasn't been having the best season at Union Berlin, so maybe there's an opportunity here just to try somebody new. Also, I don't think you risk much by bringing somebody new in because you also have Gio Reyna that could fill in at winger if somebody got injured. You have somebody like a Malik Tillman who could do the same thing. And so it's not like, I don't know, you're taking too big of a risk by bringing in maybe a young player that you just want to get a look at. So going to the 60-man provisional roster and looking at the other forwards on the list who typically play wingers, you got Ben Kramaski, Cade Cowell, Bernard Kamungo, Jordan Morris, Alejandro Zendejas, and Griffin Yao. So Ben Kramaski's hurt. Cade Cowell and Bernard Kamungo, I think it's pretty likely they're going to end up on this U23 roster. Again, they have few opportunities to prepare for the Olympics, and so I don't think they're going to try and disrupt that camp too much. Jordan Morris, I think his time really has passed for the USMNT. And then Alejandro Zendejas, well, I think he could possibly be called in. I don't know if it'd be a huge surprise because he has been in a camp, fairly recently. So the guy I'm going with here is Griffin Yao, who plays for Westerlo in the first division of the Belgian league. He's 21 years old and he's having a great season. He's got 6 goals this year, so he's in form. It could be a way of saying, hey, look, you're in form, performing at a high level, and we just want to bring you in and take a look at you, see how you fit in with the team, see how you practice, let Gregg Berhalter and the coaches, take a look at him. Again, I think that's probably like the least likely of all 3, but if we're talking about, big surprises, things that Gregg Berhalter could do to really surprise people when he announces the roster, Griffin Yao was the name I came up with there. All right, so there you go. That's 3 potential big surprises to watch out for when the USMNT roster gets released next week. My best guess is that it gets released somewhere around Wednesday, March 13th. That's before the FIFA international break starts on March 18th, and then the USMNT plays their semifinal match against Jamaica on March 21st. So I think it'll be, plus or minus a few days around that Wednesday, March 13th date. That's it for the show. Thanks to everyone for listening to Here and Abroad. If you enjoyed the episode, please share it with a fellow USMNT fan. I'm Frank Garza. You can follow me on X at FrankGarza007, and I'll be back next week with a new episode.